And now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. A.R. Vishny is the author of Night Owls. Her essays on Jewish representation in pop culture have appeared in Teen Vogue, The Washington Post, and Hey Alma. Laura R. Samotin is the author of The Sins on Their Bones. Her YA and adult fiction are grounded in Jewish myth, mysticism, and her Eastern European Jewish heritage. Veronica Schanoes is an American author of fantasy stories and associate professor in the Department of English at Queens College, CUNY, where she studies fairy tales. Thank you again for joining us today, and I'll hand things over to our speakers.
Thank you all so much for coming today. I am delighted to be speaking with these two wonderful authors. I'm not going to do intros because we just had intros. So I will just start with the first question, if that suits the both of you. Okay. So in reading your fiction, I was realizing that over the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen a real blossoming of Jewish fantasy. And I'm thinking of your work, of Aidan Polydoros, of Ariel Kaplan, of Sasha Lamb. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts as to why this is happening now, and why it might be important.
Should we start by pitching our books too, in addition to the answer?
To be sure, yes. I'm so sorry.
Okay, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. So my book is Night Owls, which is about two estries, which are bread-eating, owl-shifting Jewish women vampires from Folklore. And these two are sisters who run a theater in the East Village that you might recognize, depending on how familiar you are with independent cinemas in the East Village. That used to be a Yiddish stage. The older sister, Clara, has a rule against dating that the younger sister, Molly, just totally ignores. She has a girlfriend who's a poorly kept secret. But when this girlfriend disappears, they have to team up with their charmingly useless box office attendant who can see dead people to find her, and facing down ghosts and demons in the process. And it's a YA fantasy.
Do you want to do the question first, or should I?
Oh, sure. And for the question, yeah, I mean, I know for myself, it's definitely been exciting, the sort of outgrowth, like the recent outgrowth in Jewish fantasy. And I think a lot of it, I don't know exactly where it might come from, but I know for myself, like, because this is what I love to read, it naturally was what I wanted to write. I think there's been sort of an expanded interest in, or a desire by authors to maybe, include more of their heritage and to be a bit more forthright about it in books, and sort of Jewish authors included. And I know, like I said, for myself, fantasy is what I like to read, and what I like to write. So when it came down to like the kind of Jewish book I was going to write, it was going to be a fantasy novel.
Yeah, so hey everyone, I'm Laura Samotin. My book is The Sins on Their Bones. It is a very adult book for adult readers, so just to differentiate that, because I know we also have YA on the panel. So The Sins on Their Bones is the story of two ex-husbands on opposite sides of a civil war fighting over the same throne, with a daring and very handsome spy master caught in the crossfire. It has a magic system that's entirely based on Jewish myth and mysticism, and it's set in an alternate version of 1800s Eastern Europe, where everyone is a Jew. And the reason I wanted to write it was because I'm a huge fantasy reader. Like, I was reading Redwall in 3rd grade, and I just kind of didn't stop. And so fantasy has always been something that I've loved to read, but I never really saw myself in fantasy. The only Jews that I read about in books were when we read books about the Holocaust in school, and so Jews were either victims or they were heroes, but it was because they punched Nazis in the face. Like the only way I saw myself defined in literature was in the context of the Holocaust. And I wanted something more than that. And besides that, there was this huge, I think, cultural context that I was missing out on. So when I read the Chronicles of Narnia, I was like, it's a lion. And then years later, everyone was like, oh, it's supposed to be Jesus. And I was like, that's not Jesus, that's a lion. And they were like, you missed the whole point of the book. And I was like, I'm a Jew. Like, how was I supposed to know that was Jesus? And so I not only wanted to see people like me with positive representation in literature, I also wanted to give readers like me the experience of being in on the joke. Like, there's so much in fantasy that's Christian normative and we don't even realize it. So if you have a person who's seemingly normal and is working a normal job and then turns out to have hidden mystical relationships and powers and comes to save the day and, you know, sacrifices themselves for everyone else and then magically returns to life. Like, guess what? That's Jesus' story. It's also the plot of like 95% of the fantasy novels out there. And that's cool. I love those books, but they're not my books and they're not my story. So I wanted the opportunity to do something different. And I think, you know, getting to your question, the reason why we see so much of this now, I think is really, it's thanks to the diverse books movement. So there are a lot of people who have been pushing for more representation in literature along so many dimensions. There's really a huge dearth of BIPOC voices and queer voices and indigenous voices, all sorts of voices, and that includes Jewish voices. So I think there are editors out there who, you know, are willing and ready to champion Jewish books. We have some amazing ones coming out. I will shout out The Maiden and Her Monster by Maddie Martinez, which comes out from Tor in September of next year. It's like really a golden age of Jewish fantasy, and I think we're really lucky to kind of have gotten here on the basis of a lot of people who have been fighting for representation for a long time in literature.
Thank you so much, and thank you for introducing your books, which I'm sorry I overlooked because obviously that is very important. It is, and those were really interesting answers. I'm wondering, when you bring Jewishness to fantasy, what kind of perspective can that provide that Gentile fantasy does not? And I completely agree with you about the Christian normative fantasy tropes. I have a lot of issues with Narnia and Harry Potter as well.
He was Jesus too.
Yeah, he was Jesus too. I was like, so let me get this straight. The magical Holocaust is saved by Jesus?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Duh.
Thank you very much.
But Jesus isn't a lion this time. It's very confusing.
Jesus is a boy and heaven is a train station, and
Right.
you know, God is a wizard, but it's still Jesus.
But where's the lion? He's a Gryffindor. Okay, so there's
That's
the lion.
true. So yeah, what kind of tropes or perspectives on magic, on the fantastic, can Jewish fantasy bring to us that Gentile fantasy does not?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know, there's definitely a lot. I know for myself when I started world building, an essay that I had, which I'm sure you guys must have encountered at some point, like there are no Jewish Narnias, or like why there are no Jewish Narnias, which was written, I think at this point, probably like 10, 15 years ago. So it's
By someone else who also didn't realize that the lion was Jesus.
yeah.
Okay.
But it was like
I'm not the only one.
or that it was basically just about sort of the, you know, Christian normativity in the canon, and it's at this point out of date because there's been a lot of wonderful fantasy books that have come out since then. But it introduced a lot of very interesting questions, and I think one of them was this idea that sort of fantasy like battle between good and evil is like fundamentally a Christian concept, because it's envisioning, you know, when you have your Harry and your Voldemort, you're getting a battle between like God and Satan. And because Jews don't have this idea of Satan as a separate force, you know, separate from God, then you don't have that, you know, this idea of a battle between good and evil might not play out the same way. Or it was just an interesting question that I kind of always had in the back of my head. So I know for myself, when I then sat down to write, and I knew, let's say in my book, that we have Ashmedai, who's the prince of demons, and who is, you know, the villain in the book, like trying to figure out like how he was going to be the villain and how that was going to play out. I had that essay in the back of my head, and because I didn't want this to be again, it's not a battle of like good, evil, light and dark. You know, that became then a sort of an interesting question to wrestle with, and how to figure out how to do that in the context of a YA book that's going to be 365 pages and not like, you know, several tomes. Though I wish I could. I know also for myself, because let's say when you're dealing with Jewish folklore, you're dealing with a folklore that was created in a minority context. So that to me was something that was just interesting, because let's say the Estries do come from Ashkenazi tradition. Most of what we know about them comes from Sefer Hasidim, which is like a 13th century text that was created in, you know, medieval, what is now Germany. But it's, again, from a minority perspective. So it's like a little bit different than like picking up a book of, let's say, just typical like German folklore or German fairy tales. So that was just sort of an interesting thing to always kind of keep in mind, especially when I was trying to build out a world and sort of build out a context that was very sort of Jewish. And the characters in my book, I mean, they exist in our world, so they are minority characters. But like in the context of the book, because almost all the speaking characters are Jewish, they are sort of, it was a funny balance to like walk, because they're not in, at least in the context of the story and the narrative, they're just talking to other Jews, and they're sort of, that's the perspective.
I have a glib answer and a serious answer. So the glib answer is that the amazing thing is that because no one knows anything about Jewish folklore and mysticism, you can be a supremely uncreative author like me and just literally rip everything out of existing Jewish myth and legends and folktales, and everyone thinks you're like really creative, which is awesome. There's a special edition of this book that has Jewish, like the Havdalah prayers on the hard case, like the literal hard part of a hardback book. And I've gotten a lot of readers who've DM'd me to be like, wow, you came up with your whole own language just for your book?
That's kind of, oh gosh.
And I'm like, yeah, I'm basically like Tolkien. Like, I didn't even like do like the Elven, like I just like went with whole other letter shapes. Like, it's not even the Roman alphabet. And I'm like, but like, so like that's like the glib answer is that something that you can do that people can't do with Goyish stories is you could surprise people, because there's so much that they don't know about, and there are so many folktales. Like there's a character / object in my book that is a talking head that can predict the future, and everyone's like, wow, how'd you come up with that idea for the talking head? And I was like, from my imagination. But really the answer is that it's an Eastern European folktale about a scholar who had a tower that was packed full of awesome stuff, and the folktale is all about what people found in the tower, and one of those things was a talking head that predicted the future. And I was like, wow, what's more fantasy than that? So the head showed up in the book. But on a serious note, I do think, like Ariel said, being able to play with different types of storytelling. So in my book, there's a lot of doubt, there's a lot of questioning, there's a lot of arguing, and at the end of the day, there's no redemption for anyone. The main character, Dmitri, he is a Tsar who was deposed from his throne, and yet he's the Tsar because everyone's a Jew, right? So we get to have Jews be the rulers, which is fun. And he's done some bad things. Like he's not necessarily a completely good person. And the villain, Alexei, his ex-husband, is also, no, it's okay. It's a good song. So his husband, Alexei, is the villain, but he's not an entirely bad person either. And there's no redemption for either of them at the end. And there's also, like, not condemnation either, because I wanted to play with a more typically Jewish narrative than, like, here's the savior, he's coming along to save us, yay, he saved us, everything's cool now. I wanted it to be a lot more complex than that, because oftentimes Jewish narratives, like the Jewish religion, are. And so I wanted to honor that kind of in the way that I actually, like, sat and told this story.
These are great answers about the shape of story and how thoroughly in our culture it has been shaped around Christian narratives. So much of the Jewish fantasy I've been reading over the past few years is very queer, which I love. And I'm wondering, do you think that Jewish fantasy and queerness have something in particular to offer each other, or is it just part of a larger zeitgeist, or is it like a bit of both, do you think?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's kind of the only type of story I know how to write, because I'm a queer Jew, so that's, I don't know, it's just kind of easy because that's who I am. I mean, I think both perspectives fundamentally, like, come from communities that have been ostracized, that have been victims of persecution and violence, and also have, like, very long histories of resistance and, being proud and supportive as a community despite, external forces that really want to punish these groups for being outside of the hetero-Christian normative spectrum. And so for me, I think that these identities, I mean, I know in myself, but also in my characters, are really integral to each other. And I think, there's a lot of stuff that's been written by people who are way more versed in literary critique than me about like queering the narrative and how, all of that has influenced the way that we tell stories. But yeah, I also just like, at the end of the day, they say write what you know. And I was like, screw it. Like, if I'm going to go, I might as well go hard. And I'm going to write a book about everyone being a Jew, so they're all going to be queer too. Why not?
I love that. No, I think I know at least like how it ended up in my book was because for me, very early on, I knew that the Estries were going to be this, connected to this idea of sort of these undertold stories about women in our history, or these women who sort of vanish from memory and the sort of collective memory. And I think very quickly when you start looking into the histories of like women who have vanished from the collective memory, you get a lot of queer women. So I knew that was just going to be something that was going to be necessary for the story and something that I wanted to have in there. And particularly because, I don't know, as you might guess if you haven't gone to read the book yet, there's a lot of theater. And that informed a lot of the, storytelling decisions I made. And one of the most amazing, I don't know if anyone got the chance to see Indecent when it was running on Broadway, but I saw that and it really sort of blew my mind, and I thought was like such an interesting sort of in for talking about like Yiddish theater and that history. So for me, that was very early on. I knew I wanted to put all that in there, so that sort of informed the story. But I definitely think, I think Laura said it really well in terms of like what maybe is like why a lot of the Jewish fantasies we see have like, queer characters and queer story elements. I think there's just a lot of sort of overlap that makes that, I think how it ends up there. I don't know.
Outsider stories. Thank
Yeah,
you.
they're outsider stories.
I want to talk a little bit about the worlds you both write in. Not the worlds you write in, but the worlds you write. That Laura, your book is a secondary world fantasy. And AR, your book takes place in our world, but takes place in a world that is very historically informed and has to be constructed for the reader who may not be an expert on the history of the Lower East Side. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you envisioned and created those worlds for your reader.
Yeah. So I knew for myself, I knew a lot of the historical context going in, and I knew the big problem for the book was going to be making sure the reader understood this and had all that context. Because I understood that even within a Jewish context, people might not be familiar with like the history of Yiddish theater or, Estries and what these are. So originally, I had written out, I wrote like a backstory for Clara. And I did this originally as an exercise for myself because I kind of wanted to know, like, okay, what is the lore of Estries and who is she and how did she come to be? And when I wrote that very quickly, and it's almost exactly like it was one of the earliest things I wrote, and it was one of the few things that kind of went into the final version, almost identical from the first draft. I really liked it, and I found, and especially using sort of like an interstitial folkloric voice, became a really effective way to kind of convey a lot of that backstory that I wanted and the context I wanted, without sort of having the characters in the main narrative sit down and explain like what an estry is. And it helped reinforce it because they also do explain at one point what an estry is, a la Edward and Bella and those kind of conversations and the how long have you been 18. But because I knew I needed to explain to the reader what an estry was and that it's going to be unfamiliar, so I figured if I could do it several times, then it would really reinforce it and it would help that stick. So yeah, that became, using that sort of folkloric voice to present the information became a kind of key way to do that.
Like, y'all, no one should ever ask me a question about world building in a professional context because I'm chaos incarnate. Like, I went in with no plan. I had no world building documents. I was just like, I want to write a book where everyone's a Jew, and I don't want anything bad to happen to anyone because they're Jewish. And that was my premise, because I read to escape and I write to escape. Like I said, it's very important to have narratives that are historically based, that speak to traumas that our community has actually experienced, but that's not for me. And so I was like, okay, how do we get rid of anti-Semitism? Well, everyone's a Jew. Anti-Semitism fixed. Super easy. But then I was like, well, I want to write about Eastern Europe because that's where my family's from. We're Lithuanian Jews from Vilna, was Russia back then. And I was like, yeah, but like people are going to get confused if it's Russia, but everyone's a Jew because everyone knows Russia. So I was like, let me just change the name. That was easy. So my characters are in exile in Lietuva. Sounds a lot like Lithuania.
Nobody will know.
They're in a city called Wilnetsk, which is like a few extra letters tacked onto Wilna. Yeah, like I said, I'm lazy like that. And so I just started kind of like altering things, but not that much because I wanted it to read like a familiar place and a familiar time, but just reimagined. And so it got to the point where like my publisher asked me like, hey, can you draw a map? Because we think that we want to like put a map in the book. And I was like, okay. So I drew a map and I turned it in and my editor wrote back, she's like, Laura, we have a problem. I was like, oh, my map drawing skills are that bad. And she's like, well, no, you drew a map of Eastern Europe. And I was like, I did? And she was like, yeah, like, look at it. Like, do you know what Eastern Europe looks like? And I was like, yeah, my day job, I'm a professor of international relations. Let me take another look. And so, yeah, lo and behold, I had reproduced a map of Eastern Europe. And so that's why there's no map in book one. But, you know, so some of it's the same, but other stuff, I made the very deliberate choice not to go in and explain everything based on Jewish myth and mysticism and folklore and religious practice. So, like, there's Havdalah in my book. Characters don't stop and go, and here for Havdalah, which is the service that we are, you know, using to celebrate the end of Shabbat. Because in Christian books, no one ever stops to go, and by the way, this lion is Jesus. Like, which is how I missed so much of it. Like, no one bothers to explain because everything is assumed, and yet somehow readers are able to read these books with these wild, invented, made-up things that no one ever explains and just accept it as, like, fantasy. And I was like, I can do that too, I think. So there's not a lot of world building in this in the traditional sense because I took our world and just slightly reimagined it and relabeled the map. And I did so, like, half to be glib, but also half in a really, I think, like, earnest attempt to trick people into learning more about actual Jewish culture and heritage in a way that wouldn't hit them until the end when they got to the author's note. And I'm like, surprise! Everything in here is real. Like, the place names aren't real and the story isn't real, but everything else is. And so I deliberately did not want to use a lot of the world building tricks that people use in fantasy so that I could obscure that for the readers, so that I could get them to kind of come along for the ride and come out the other side accidentally having learned a whole bunch about Jewish myth, mysticism, and culture without it smacking them over the face.
On the subject of that lion, I just have to say, when I read Narnia when I was a little girl, I was so outraged by Aslan's resurrection. Because I'm not Christian, obviously, all I could think was, that is cheating. I know about dead. You said he was dead. Dead is dead. So if he's not a ghost and he's not a vampire, he should be dead. And I just could not. Also, the idea that, like, the worst thing you could imagine would be winter without Christmas. I was like, I mean, I don't like being cold, but whatever, Lewis. Okay. Let's talk about research, because so much of what both of you build in your books is based on folklore. What was your favorite part of research? What were your favorite sources? What kinds of sources did you go to? And what's the relationship between your research and writing process? Like, do you do all the research and then write, or back and forth?
So, like, for me, well, some of it was, like, a long time coming. So because, like, the book is set in the East Village, and I had lived in the East Village for, oh my goodness. I'll try to act natural. So because I had lived in the East Village, long before I had written the book, but I knew this was, like, even before I'd written the book and knew that, and it was a, glimmer in my eye, I really liked the history of the neighborhood, and I always found that interesting. So a lot of it was just information that had accumulated over time. Like, I knew about the Yiddish Walk of Fame, like, in front of the Chase Bank, and the movie theater. When I knew I wanted to, this was the book I wanted to write, like, some of the pieces I loved. There's a book, and I think I cited in my endnote, but from Bowery to Broadway, it's edited by Edna Nashon, I think. which is this fantastic history of the Yiddish theater, which I highly recommend to everyone. It's a highly readable book, despite being sometimes nonfiction can be a little dense. It's great, and it's so unexpected in a lot of ways. I think people go in with a preconceived notion of what Yiddish theater is, and totally, avant-garde, and is sort of rich and as varied as our, English language theater is today, which is an important thing to sort of know, and something I really wanted to convey in the text was that at its peak, the Yiddish theater scene was about as large as the English theater scene in the city. Another fun thing I did, not to plug the place we are in, but the Museum of Jewish Heritage hosts shows from Folksbiene, which is the longest continuous Yiddish theater production company in the world. And it's fantastic, and they do many wonderful shows. And you may have seen the Yiddish Fiddler translation recently, which was fantastic. And I think getting to see the Yiddish theater performed live, and getting to sort of, and a lot of it's just seeing live theater really helped inform then the research. Other things that I really liked, I also did like a lot of wild sort of research that never made it into the final book, just for like wider context. Like when I knew Boaz was going to be a Syrian Jew, and I knew that he was going to live in Brooklyn, I did try to get a hold of every book remotely relevant that I could. And I ended up reading, was it Maddie Friedman's book on the Aleppo Codex, which is just about like where did the missing pages of the Aleppo Codex go? Absolutely fascinating book. None of it made it into the final draft. Highly recommend if you're interested in sort of the black market for rare Jewish books. But it was actually a really interesting sort of backdrop of like the Syrian Jewish experience. So that was something that I, highly recommended, even though absolutely none of it made it into this book at all.
I have a way less legit answer than that. So I had a story in mind, and I was sitting down and writing it, and I was like, it would be really cool if Dimitri's husband came back from the dead. Sorry, he's not a demon and he's not a vampire.
No. In your book, it was different. It wasn't like he was just walking around.
Well, he is just walking around, just dead.
He's
dead,
not a lion,
so
it's
he's
fine.
not a lion.
There are no lions in this book. I promise.
Mine is a lion,
There's no Jesus either. So I was like, it'd be super cool. What if he was dead? That would just like up the drama, I think. And so what I did was something that, like, if you're a student, never do this. I would fail a student who did this in one of my classes. I literally just backfilled all the research. I was like, it'd be cool if he was dead. And so I opened one of the books that I cite in my bibliography that they let me put in the book. And a lot of it was the Book of Legends is really good, and the Jeffrey Dennis Encyclopedia of Jewish Myth, Magic, and Mysticism was also a huge help. And I literally just looked under D for dead, and I was like, I guess we have a myth for, like, one of the beauties about being from a storytelling culture is that we have stories about everything. And so it was really actually not that hard to just find myths that I wanted to slot in. And in flipping through all these encyclopedias and flipping through these compendiums of folk tales and lore and all of that, I sometimes came across stuff that was really cool, and I was like, yeah, that should definitely be in here, like the talking head. So, that's how I found a bunch of like really obscure things. Like, I think legally I should say, like, don't do this, don't try this at home, but Jews in Eastern Europe believed that if you took the afterbirth of a black cat and you dried it out and you ground it into a powder and you put it in your eyes, you would be able to see demons. Like, don't do that again. But like, it's just like fun stuff that like sounds totally fake and made up, but this was really something that people actually believed. So that was the bulk of it. And then other parts are just kind of folk tales and superstitions that I had known about my whole life, but like didn't know why people said these things. Like, you can't drink water if it's been left out overnight uncovered, like, because the water would get dirty. Like, that was something that my grandparents said, and I was like, dusty? They're like, dirty. Well, it turns out that an Eastern European myth is that demons will go into water that's left out uncovered overnight. And if you drink the water, you can drink the demon, and you don't want to drink a demon. I don't know what will happen to you, but nothing good. So I, was able to take some of these superstitions and then like actually figure out where they came from and work those in as well. So I did a flipped research process that, again, I wouldn't recommend in an academic context, but I guess I'm a professor, so I have a license to do what I want.
That's totally what they told me when they gave me the
100%.
PhD.
I got the PhD, and they were like, you spent 8 years learning how to do this. Now you could do the exact opposite, and no one can get you in trouble.
Here's my question. The afterbirth of a black cat who's given birth, or the afterbirth of a black cat who has been born?
Who's given birth.
Okay, thank you.
It's the placenta of a black cat.
Right, so, but the cat in question is the cat who birthed the placenta, not the cat who was attached to the placenta.
Yes.
Okay. You never know, and knowledge will come in useful.
I mean, again, don't try that. Like, I don't want to get sued by someone who's like, I was at this book festival and someone told me to like go find a cat.
Sorry, what I was going to say just fell out of my head because I was filled with cat placenta thoughts.
Yeah, it's a striking one.
Yes. All right. I remember I read the note in your book about the Syrian Jewish community in Brooklyn, and I read it and I thought, well, that sounds fascinating, and I was really eager to hear more. So I'm wondering if now might be a good time to ask you to talk more about that.
Yeah. So I should preface, I'm not Syrian. So this was that was a lot of sort of extra research in addition to working with a sensitivity reader, like when I knew that was what I wanted to do. I think in addition to to reading the Aleppo Codex was an interesting one. I also found early on when I knew that the nice thing is because these scenes took place in the present day, when I wanted to know what does a synagogue look like in the Syrian Jewish community, you can go onto the synagogue website. You can go to Gravesend. You can and that's honestly some of the details, how I figured it out. I think it didn't make it into the final draft, but early on, I think Boaz looked at a bulletin board, and I wanted to make sure I was going to list off classes or things that are going on in the synagogue. So it was really helpful. I could go and find the synagogue's the synagogue that I was using as inspiration. I could go on their Facebook page and see what are the events that are going on. Do they have a Hebrew school? What kind of classes? Things like that. So that was one also sort of piece of kind of community research that I did. Mm-hmm. Like I said, I also had a wonderful sensitivity reader who helped. She helped me check names of characters, and also had called me out because I did originally have Boaz going to Ramaz, which is a prep school in the city, for people who don't know. And she was like, that's really far. Why is he commuting an hour and a half every day to school? And you're yeah, you're right. That's a little unfair to him. So that is why he goes to a fictional prep school. So yeah, I mean, that was a lot of the research, but I knew I knew early on that I wanted to have him. I knew Boaz was always going to be a Mizrahi. I knew he was going to be Syrian when I decided that Gravesend as a place name was too perfect to pass up for a kid who could see dead people. And because I then figured out that Gravesend had a long-standing Syrian Jewish community, then that sort of informed how I made those decisions.
And Laura, what piece of research did not make it in that you were particularly fond of, if any? Because your book is rich, but perhaps there was something that didn't make it in.
Nothing didn't make it in because in edits, all I did was add more. Yeah. The book went from being small to being big. So everything made it in there. There were just a couple of things that we tweaked just for the plot, but nothing major actually got left out.
That's lovely. What a privilege. I meant that in the good way. So I think now we should open up. Actually, let me ask first, do you two have questions for each other at all before I open up to...
Can I torture you with the Taco Bell question, or
I guess.
So because we were discussing beforehand, if your characters we're gonna go eat tacos, what is your taco order?
They're all Eastern European Jews, so the least spicy thing that they could possibly get. I don't know. My main character Dimitri is very depressed at the time of the beginning of the book. So I think something really greasy, because he spends a lot of the early book drunk. So again, this is an adult book for adult readers. I want to disclaim that again for anyone who just walked in. This is a book about a divorce. It is not meant for children. So yeah, I don't know, like something plain, like chicken tacos with like rice and a lot of cheese, like a lot of cheese. I don't know what anyone else would eat.
That's fair.
Yeah, what's your character's favorite snack foods?
I mean, because so like Clara and Molly are a little bit limited because they're bread eating vampires. So in addition
What's
to
their favorite bread snack?
oh well, I feel like for both of them it's a salt bagel. But there's like a slight difference where in like in Clara it's like always nicely cut. Like, maybe with like a bagel guillotine. I like to think that Boaz had gifted her a bagel guillotine because it's like the most violent way to cut a bagel, but you get a perfect slice. And that she eats it on a plate and maybe like a little bit toasted. Um, Molly is like more chaotic, so she's gonna eat it out straight it out of the bag. I think she prefers like I think is it pop up bagels is they're into like the rip and dip method. She would be a ripper. Um, Boaz likes to pretend he doesn't know what a bagel is, but really he is a lifelong New Yorker. He just likes to annoy Clara, and he probably likes I think cinnamon raisin bagels just to offend her.
I'm offended too,
Yeah.
actually. That's really offensive.
I think it's just to like mostly upset her.
All right, let's open up to any questions that you all might have. I'm going to repeat questions when they're asked just to make sure that people can hear them. Who would like to start us off? Sure.
I saw on your Instagram that you posted something about goats and that having to do with your next book. Can you tell us a bit more?
So this is a question for AR about her next book and goats on her Instagram.
Yeah, so I don't 100 because I do not have another book under contract yet. I like goats a lot. They're
I like them too.
they're really fascinating, and there's a fascinating history with Jews and goats and Yom Kippur. And that is all I will say. I don't know if it will make it into the final draft.
Oh no, not this. The poor goat.
All right, there is a hand all the way in the back belonging to someone who I can't see otherwise. Hi.
Kind of continuing on the topic of folklore and mysticism and stuff like that, like why the specific mysticisms that you included, Sarah, for you, and then for you, AR, around like why Estries? So like, we do have a really large and long and insane folklore and myth background. Why the ones you chose?
So the question is why the specific mysticisms in the sins on their bones and why estries for night owls?
Yeah, so I know for me, Estries, I had not. It wasn't something I grew up with. I think most people. It's like even in sort of the pantheon of like Jewish folklore and being obscure for most people, like Estries, like a lot of people haven't heard of Estries. I had come across them. I had heard about them in a talk that was given, but it was an author, Rena Rosner, gave a talk on on Jewish folklore and monsters, and she mentioned this. It was already like way back in 2019, and I was drawn originally to the detail about Estries, how they fly when they let their hair down, and that a lot of the magic is bound up in their hair. As someone who like has very curly, thick hair and has sort of a lot of Jewish feelings bound up in my hair, this was like immediately fascinating to me. But I didn't know what to do with it at the time. I also grew up in the golden age or came of age in the golden age of YA vampires in 2008. So I loved vampires, and I loved the hair thing, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I kind of put it in my back pocket. And eventually I knew I wanted, when I knew I was going to start writing this thing about the East Village, I knew originally I was like pulling from old like abandoned projects of mine, and I had at one point tried to write something that was like set in the Yiddish theater and just was like historical fiction, and I loved those characters, but I didn't know I wanted to write something contemporary. So I was like, well, I want to have these girls in the present day. How can I do that? It's like, I can do that if they're vampires. So then that became the very easy way to take them into the present, and I knew that was sort of the right detail. There was also, I think, after a long time of like YA being sort of like, ugh, we're sick of vampires, people were starting to miss them. So suddenly, like a few years ago, you started seeing editors be like, yeah, I kind of want a vampire book actually. So that also felt like, ugh, my moment has arrived finally.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess getting more into the construction of like the types of folklore that are included in the Sins on Their Bones, it's set up as a book that asks what would have happened to Judaism as a religion in Eastern Europe if there had never been Christian persecution, because a lot of Judaism was Christianized in Eastern Europe during the 17 and 1800s, during the Jewish Reformation there, because of concerns about pogroms. And so many rabbis ordered their congregations to get rid of things that were seen as like pagan or magical, superstitious. That's when we started seeing Jewish services seem and feel more like Christian services in a church. And so I wanted to kind of delve into like, well, what if that hadn't happened? Like, what if there was a strand of Judaism that was still like actively and vibrantly like magical in that way, kind of like in the way that Kabbalah is. So I kind of like tweaked that a little bit. Alexei, who is again the guy who deposed his ex-husband and won the civil war that they fought, did so because he practices a version of Judaism that he calls the holy science, because he consorts with demons and he believes in like being able to summon demons to derive power from that. He believes that God is talking to him. Like, spoiler alert, if your husband is like, God is talking to me, that's a bad sign. Like,
Especially if he's dead.
things might, yeah, the day that your husband comes back from the dead because he makes you do an obscure Jewish ritual to like rejuvenate him based on the homunculus of Maimonides, like that should be red flag number 1. But red flag number 2 is when he claims that God is talking to him. Like, when people tell you who they are, you should listen. So yeah, like he has this vein of Jewish mysticism that's a lot like Kabbalah in some ways, but is also kind of my imagining of what Judaism would have been like in a more like, I guess, like superstitious or magical iteration. And then we have like Reformation Judaism. I never call it Judaism in the book. I call it Ludaism, which is me. Doesn't it sound the same? I took Judaism, I translated it into Russian in Google Translate, and then I had it speak out the word, and then I typed the letters that I heard, and it came out as Ludaism, and then congratulations, that was that. Because I was like, if I call it Judaism, it will be way too obvious, right? So, you know, that's kind of how I picked some of the superstitions that went into the book, is like, what would it have looked like? Jewish mystics back in the day did drugs and ecstatic dance and had sex to commune with angels and spirits and demons, and like that was a very real part of their practice of Judaism as a religion. And so I wanted to bring that kind of into the book. And so half of it was me trying to find stuff that was like just legit good fantasy, like rituals to bring people back from the dead. That's just good fantasy, right? But also half of it was wanting to pick up on parts of Judaism that weren't going to be familiar to modern Jewish readers, and take those and bring them into conversation with something that looks a lot more like Judaism today.
The difference between your dead czar and Aslan is that your dead czar comes back wrong and
Yeah.
and messed up, and also he's cold, right? There are physical
like
and emotional
the typical
signs.
like shadow daddy thing. It's like he came back but bad.
Yeah.
He came back but bad.
Whereas Aslan comes back and everybody's like, "Oh yeah, that's great. That'll happen. We totally understand. There was deeper magic."
I mean, he was a lion who talked too, so like something was already wrong there.
The Cowardly Lion talked too, but like you knew if he died, he'd be
There
dead.
was also something wrong there too. That's also scary.
Well, I mean, yes, in the pink sweater. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I'm just not hearing. Could you? Oh,
I still can't hear. I'm sorry. My hearing is so bad. I'm so sorry. Oh, what about it?
Yeah, that person is just saying they want to play devil's advocate, and that revival. I don't want to speak for you. I'm sorry. Like there is a concept of like the dead.
Yeah.
rise.
Yeah.
oh yeah, but like you don't have like a savior who everyone like weeps over and mourns, and then like the next day is like, oh yeah, he's fine, right? With like there's an actual thing that has to. Um,
So you both mentioned that you wrote queer characters for a specific reason. Was there anything that you had to like really consider, or anything that you maybe didn't write or wanted to write but couldn't figure out how to work it in because the characters are queer and Jewish?
so the question is there anything queer Jewish, having queer Jewish characters prevented you from writing that you wanted to?
It didn't prevent me from writing anything, but I think it made the book a much, much, much harder sell. Because at the end of the day, like being an author in this way is a business proposition, and the way that publishers decide whether books are going to be marketable is they look at books that have already sold and they say like, okay, well, like how would this compare to like Song of Achilles, or how would this compare to, I don't know, Shadow and Bone, like and so when you write stuff that is representing a Venn diagram of two like minority communities, then publishers look at it and go like, how many people are going to buy this book? Well, surprise, the answer's a lot. But I think it definitely, I think if you are an author today who chooses to write double marginalization, you are making, you know, you're taking a leap of faith that you're going to land with a publishing team that believes that these stories aren't just for the communities that they represent, they're for everyone. I always say like the happiest day for me as a writer is going to be the day that like the LGBT section in bookstores is gone, because like they're just stories, right? Like right now it's like, oh, we have like Jewish fantasy. And I'm like, yeah, it is Jewish fantasy, but it's also just fantasy. Like we don't label Chronicles of Narnia Christian fantasy. Like
We totally should.
There's no Christian fantasy section of Barnes and Noble, right? There's no Jewish fantasy section either, but you know, I think that they're just stories about people and for people, and they're stories where, at least in what I write, because I have a bunch of queer Jewish speculative fiction coming out, all for adults, over the next few years. I hope that they're stories that make certain readers feel very at home, but that they're homes that any reader could walk into and feel welcome. I don't want to, you know, necessarily, I don't know, like be like, these are niche books for niche readers. These like our communities do deserve books for them, but they're also just books for everyone. So I think that like that's what choosing to write a queer Jewish book did, is it made me have to fight to prove that a lot of people wanted to read these kinds of stories and didn't particularly care that they were queer Jewish stories. I mean, there are people who thought I made up the Hebrew alphabet, which like I will totally claim. Like, sure, 100%, that's what I did. But it definitely makes it harder. You're fighting against the tide of like traditional publishing, which still is dominated by straight, white, Christian inflected fantasy.
Yeah, no, I mean that about covers it. I mean, I mean, honestly, it wasn't didn't really like factor into my writing at all. There wasn't anything that I was like, I can't write that. I do wonder sometimes, like because it's a YA book and it's technically kidlit, that I was really shocked that I was talking about this earlier with someone that I think one of the best sort of advocates for the book has been like a librarian in Alabama. And I'm like, wow, that's really lovely. I'm glad you were able to get the book. Don't know how you did that, were able to get that. So I think, that's sort of something that's been in the back of my head. But, I think just being able to sort of like hoping that it reaches libraries and gets into schools. But yeah, we will see. As an author, you also have such little control over it. It's like all I can control is like the book I've written and put out there. And you just hope it reaches the people you want it to reach.
Yeah. So is there like a folklore, Jewish folklore that didn't make it into this book that you would want to include in the next book? Like a piece, well, for both of you, but like a piece of like a story that we heard growing up or anything.
Folklore for the next books.
So like, I don't. So if anyone has read the book, I make a joke a few times about a leviathan in the plumbing, or maybe once. And so I don't think I got to mention this. So I am a pantser. I do not plot books. I should plot. It would be so much better for my sanity if I did, which means that the ending of that book changed, of Night Owls changed every single draft. In an earlier draft, there was a Leviathan in the plumbing who burst out triumphantly at the sort of final, like in the climax, and like ate Ashmedai. That is not how the book ends. I'm sorry to spoil it for people. But yeah, one of these days I'll finally get to write my Leviathan book.
Yeah, I had a lot of leftover stuff like Jewish mysticism and stuff, which is amazing because after I wrote this book, I had to write a whole other book because it's a duology. So this is the first book in a series. The second book, which concludes the series, is The Lure of Their Graves, and it comes out, I think, June 3rd of next year. So it was a good thing I had a lot left over.
Excellent. Yes, standing.
This, first of all, thank you both so much. This is so fascinating and exciting. I'm really excited to read both of these books. Um, so I'm thinking about like you're drawing a lot, both of you, on Jewish folklore from Eastern Europe or not Eastern Europe, and there's like a lot of I think our collective knowledge maybe of Jewish folklore from Eastern Europe, especially from a lot of communities that have been wiped out, comes to us from at least in part through sort of interlocutors from Maskilic and Maskilish circles, like the Vav and Vivo types and Ansky and that sort of thing, which has its own, there's a sort of filtering and a sort of a distance that happens by the time that those stories get into a lot of the certainly like academic written consciousness. And I'm wondering how you see yourself, like, do you see yourselves as fundamentally of, and you're writing as fundamentally of that culture, those cultures, or as separate from and trying to communicate some sort of like Jewish authenticity, like a lot of those folks were doing, to a culture that isn't necessarily familiar with it, and including among Jewish readers, and also how do things like we're talking about like the leaving water out overnight and demons and black cats and stuff, a lot of which like is in the Gemara. So actually, it's still living, it's still alive for a lot of Jewish readers potentially, and certainly not all. And where you see yourself speaking to those different kinds of audiences. Are you? Yeah, that's.
I don't know how to recap that one because it was so nuanced and thoughtful a question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like at the end of the day, I wrote this book for me. And I'm a person, I grew up culturally and religiously Jewish in a Jewish community, and I didn't know a lot of this stuff, right? Like this book was half me relying on stuff that I had heard as a kid but didn't understand like the roots of, and half me educating myself about my own culture and religions. Like one of the really interesting things that I did was Deatra Cohen and a co-author whose name I cannot remember right now wrote a book on Ashkenazi herbalism, which I found really fascinating because like my grandparents would always be like, if you're sick you should eat raspberries, and I'm like, cool. But it turns out, and like no one knew why again, but it turns out that raspberries and raspberry leaves were an Eastern European cure-all for like the common cold and respiratory illnesses. So like half of it was like me finding out new stuff, and half of it was me finding out that my own family was the recipient of knowledge that had been stripped over time, either by forgetting or assimilation or just like the distortion of knowing about it from all of these interlocutors. So I guess in a way that like I am writing for that person because that person is me, and trying to think through and imagine again like what the world would have been like if we didn't have that loss of knowledge for so many reasons. Like, poverty was a big reason why we lost a lot of this indigenous folk wisdom from Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. A lot of the people who were keepers of this knowledge were women who weren't literate. And so when that oral tradition is broken by displacement and violence, like you don't get that back in the same way. So I wanted to think like, what if we had a more unbroken line of knowledge transmission? What would that have looked like, and how would people have felt about the traditions that they've received? So yeah, I mean like, Your question was really good and also super complex. It's probably something that someone should write like a dissertation about. But that's kind of my like weak immediate answer to what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an excellent answer. And a fascinating question. I know, like, for myself, one of the things I found tricky about my book, because I knew I was coming in with something that was a fairly obscure piece of folklore. And I also play with, like, shadim and all these things. So it's all, I knew for myself at least, like, I grew up, like, in a conservative synagogue. And from sort of that, not a mystical tradition, I think you have to go pretty far removed before you hit a chassid in my family. Um, and and I know that's not an atypical experience. So when I'm coming to this and you're looking at sort of those sources, it's like, oh, this isn't sort of an organic piece of my like personal family like experience. And for a lot of people, but so I didn't want to. I knew for myself I was walking the line where I wanted some of this stuff to be there, but I wanted it to feel authentic and to feel, not like it was being sort of put on. Like so for me, I was really concerned about how do I make this feel like rooted in something that does feel familiar to people. And for me, the way to do that was, I mean, to pull in those sources, but also to really ground it in like concrete history. So for myself, that was also part of the reason where there's a lot of backstory about like the Yiddish theater and things like that. I wanted to tie it to something that was very familiar to me. So that way, adding in that sort of natural extension of like the mystical, didn't feel like a huge leap. It wasn't just like, oh, there's this like cool thing. It's like there was this. I wanted it to feel like a natural outgrowth of something that is very widely familiar to people, which in this case, after sort of playing around, became this idea of like sort of the woman, like the Jewish woman who doesn't get all that she's owed, and the Jewish woman who sort of society kind of wanted to crush a little bit. So that was sort of my like way to do it, and sort of the way I reconciled playing with sort of a tradition that's more mystical than like the Judaism that I sort of live in the day to day.
We have time for one last question. Sorry, say. Oh, okay. Yes, in the back, standing. Yes.
Oh,
Thanking AR for her great Syrian Jewish representation, and also a question about which characters would like to
God.
try Syrian cuisine.
So like one, I'm so glad because again, my big always concern was that like it's like I know when I'm putting something out there that people actually from the community might read it, and I'm glad that it resonated and what you weren't like because again, like I said, my biggest fear is that you'd like look at it and be like, oh my god, like this asshole, sorry. like and now I'm going to sound really stupid because so originally there was a different version of the text argument, and I'm thinking out loud right now, between Boaz and Daniel, where originally Daniel comes home, and he came home because, and it was, I'm blanking on the food that his mom made him, but that was originally the conversation, so that's what they would enjoy. But I feel really stupid right now because I do not remember the name, but I will hunt you down afterward and tell you what it is because... Yeah, no, and I have the answer for you. It's just like the word is like on the tip of my tongue. I'm like so sorry, but like, we'll put a pin on it. I will come back to you with this one. Yeah, like hold me to it. I'll make a post about it and everything.
Great. Well, I want to thank our two panelists for coming out today.
Thank you. Wait, can I also say?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So we're signing books, right, from 4 to 4:30. So come chill, hang out. I got goodies for people. If you like bookmarks, yeah, I came prepared. Blatant pitch, please buy our books. It's a great way of showing publishing that people actually want to read our stories. So if you can, that'd be great. Or request them at your local libraries. That's also always amazing.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for moderating.
Thank you so much, and for doing the business part of my job that I seem to be blanking on today. And thank you all for coming out to see them.